Got it. Okay. Look at that. We act like we know what we're doing. Well, welcome back, folks. We've been talking about the Ozarks history the last few weeks. And today we're going to talk about a group of people that we don't hear a lot about in the Ozarks for a reason. In fact, there's a limited population of them, and that's the Blacks in the Ozark. As we've already talked about, we know that most people that live in the Ozarks from the history were basically Scotch-Irish in ancestry. And the Ozarks, if you're familiar with it at all, you know that there is not a large African-American population in the Ozarks. And yet they played a part in the history of the Ozarks, and I think that we need to talk about them. Unfortunately, this isn't the most pleasant subject sometimes because there were some really terrible incidents that occurred, and we're going to talk about one of those that occurred in 1906 in Springfield. But for today, we're going to start off by spotlighting a famous Ozarker, and this man happens to be a Black person, obviously, and I'll bet some millions out there probably have already begun to guess who it might be. This is none other than George Washington Carver, probably one of the most famous Black scientists of the late 1800s, early 1900s in America. He was born and raised in Diamond, Missouri, which is west of Springfield, probably about 40 miles. His homestead is now a National Historic Site, National Park. You can go there and visit. It's not a really big situation. I've been there some years back, and I'll be honest, I was a little disappointed. I thought there might be more to it than what there was, but it does give us pause to look at George Washington Carver and the contributions he made to not just the Black citizens of America, but to all citizens of America. And I guess the best way to do this is I've got a short little film. I usually have a film seem like the end of my presentation. Today, I'm going to start off with a short film. And so this is just about a 5-minute thing about George Washington Carver. I thought you might be interested since he is a homegrown Ozarker.
Born into slavery in Missouri, George Washington Carver was orphaned as an infant and raised by Moses and Susan Carver, the family who had owned his mother. As a frail child, he was not required to help with heavy farm chores and spent his days exploring nature and the plants in the Carver house. Soon, he became known as the plant doctor. George left the Carver home to pursue an education on his own. After 2 years, he earned a certificate of merit and would have to move again in order to continue learning. He moved 75 miles away to Fort Scott, Kansas. He worked at menial jobs while trying to save enough money for school, but his life was a lonely one filled with poverty, cruelty, and prejudice. When he witnessed a Black man being lynched, he fled. He had been accepted to Highland College in Kansas, but on arrival, he was turned away because of his race. In 1886, he settled on a farm in Ness County, Kansas. While there, he performed agricultural experiments that would later be valuable to him. George was able to save enough money for a semester at Simpson College in Iowa to study art. Out of 300 attending, he was the only Black student, and he was welcomed. He was described as having a burning zeal to know everything. His art teacher was so impressed with his ability with plants and encouraged him to major in horticulture. He transferred to Iowa State Agricultural College and graduated in 1894. In 1896, having received a master's, George was offered a position by respected educator Booker T. Washington of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. At Tuskegee, George decided on his purpose in life. He was going to help a former slave population become self-sufficient through farming.
Carver had been trained in Iowa in the natural sciences, in botany. And as a scientist and investigator, Carver was a deeply practical man. He wanted to turn science into products that would benefit the Black rural poor.
He developed the Jessup wagon, a movable laboratory on wheels to help educate farmers. He encouraged them to rotate their crops to conserve the nutrients in the soil and to give up soil-depleting cotton crops. He persuaded the farmers to plant peanuts instead. In his Tuskegee lab, he developed over 300 uses for the peanut and 100 uses for the sweet potato, anything from beverages to medicines to paints. Carver collaborated with Henry Ford in developing alternative fuels with soybeans. He also perfected a process for extracting rubber from the milk of the goldenrod plant.
Carver produced a series of scientific inventions that were primarily designed to enhance the economic and agricultural productivity of the Black Belt. They benefited Black and white farmers alike.
This prolific scientist was also a painter, a crocheter, and a musician, even raising money for the Tuskegee Institute by touring as a pianist. He had once turned down the opportunity to work with Thomas Edison because he believed he would do more good at Tuskegee.
After World War I, by the 1920s, Carver had become something of a legend, a folk hero to the Black South.
George Washington Carver died on January 5th, 1943. He was buried at Tuskegee next to his friend Booker T. Washington. His tombstone reads, "He could have added fortune to fame, but caring for neither, he found happiness and honor in being helpful to the world."
George Washington Carver's greatest accomplishment was in being a role model to a generation of young African-American scientists who followed him.
Okay, so that's a nice film clip about George Washington Carver. Again, unfortunately, I think he's kind of a forgotten person in this world today, but he really did a lot of important things for this country, not just the Black population, but for all as well. And by the way, no, he did not invent peanut butter. I know a lot of people think that, but he was not the inventor of peanut butter. He did a whole lot of things with peanuts and a whole lot of things with sweet potatoes, but he didn't invent peanuts as such. So, how did the African American experience start out in the Ozarks? Well, it started out just about like everywhere else. They were slaves that were brought in. The first African Americans entered the Ozarks as slaves way back in the 1700s, when the French first brought them in to work the lead mines over in the eastern part of the Ozarks. We saw earlier where Philip Renault purchased 500 slaves and brought them in from Santo Domingo in the 1720 to work as lead mines near the town of Potosi, Missouri. There were other slaves that were brought in to work primarily the Missouri and the Mississippi River border areas, working the tobacco farms. Cotton was never a big crop in Missouri. The climate's not correct, the soil's not correct. Instead, the big crop in the Ozarks was tobacco, and as well as hemp. Both these were very important crops. They were also very labor intensive and required, a lot of hard work. And that's one of the reasons they brought in the large number of slaves that they did. But it really wasn't until the Louisiana Purchase came around, and we purchased Louisiana from the French in 1803, that we finally saw the large number of slaves really begin to enter Missouri. Now, we've already talked about some of the reasons that happened when we talked about why Missouri became a state so rapidly, why there were so many people moved into Missouri. And one of them was because of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 forbade slavery in the states east of Mississippi and north of the Ohio River. And as a result, slave owners in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, northern part of Kentucky, those areas like that begin to move into an area that was, home to slaves, and that was Missouri. So they brought their slaves with them. And that kind of encouraged it. This is a photograph. I'll be honest, this is not a photograph of slaves in Missouri. This is a very well-known photograph of slaves that was taken prior to the Civil War. But this would have been a scene that you probably would have seen in some communities in the Ozarks. Now, that being said, let's look at slavery and exactly how it was handled in the Ozarks. As I've said, most of these slave owners brought their slaves with them from the areas of the upland South, and they moved them here to primarily work the fields along the Missouri and the Mississippi River border. Most people, when you think of slavery, you think of South. Actually, the southern part of Missouri, the Ozarks, was not the home to very many slaves. The reason was because the land wasn't very conducive, and they couldn't grow those labor-intensive crops like tobacco and hemp. Those were primarily found up on the big river valleys. In fact, the Missouri River Valley got the nickname of Little Dixie. And prior to the Civil War, that's what that area was known as Little Dixie. That was the real large slave population area, was up on the Missouri River and along the southern part of the Mississippi River. So the interior just really didn't have a whole lot of slaves in it. That's not to say they weren't slaves, but primarily they were there for personal service. They weren't there to work big fields because there were no big fields. There were counties in the Ozarks prior to the Civil War that had no slaves. Douglas County, which is the home to Ava, Missouri, southeast of Greene County and Springfield. In the 1860 census, there was actually not one Black person in Douglas County in the census prior to the Civil War. So, that would have not been unusual to have traveled in the Ozarks in the first half of the 19th century and found areas where there were absolutely no slaves because, frankly, most people in the Ozarks didn't need them or couldn't afford them. They were expensive. This is a tobacco shop. This is one photograph I found in my research that shows a tobacco plant where they rolled tobacco and harvested tobacco in Springfield, Missouri. And it showed, obviously, you've got several slaves there, as well as some white overseers that are obviously working the thing. So how were slaves treated in Missouri? Well, the number of slaves, as I've said, was small when compared to other slave states. In fact, when the Civil War broke out, only Delaware as a slave state had fewer slaves than Missouri, even though Missouri had a huge population. In fact, the case I read somewhere where there was probably less than 10% of the people in Missouri actually owned slaves. So it was a small number, and those that owned them usually had no more than 1 to 5. So it just wasn't a really huge slave owning state in that terms. We had a much larger population in terms of how many slaves. And there were also a lot of free Blacks living in St. Louis by the Civil War. There were Blacks that were not slaves that were living in the state of Missouri. Most of them were in St. Louis. I'm sure there were some out in the Ozarks and some of the other areas of Missouri, but most of them lived in St. Louis. Now, Missouri had a set of slave codes, and it afforded the slave maybe a little bit better protection than some slave states had, but still not much. So let's look at some of the conditions in these slave codes. Slaves could not own property in the state of Missouri. So if you were a slave, you could not own anything. You instead were owned. Could not be a witness against a white in court. So if a white person was brought to court for a criminal cause or a civil cause, you could not be a witness if you were a Black person in that court against a white person. You could not consume liquor. No meetings were held unless supervised by whites. At least that was the way it was supposed to be. I think we're all aware that the blacks were very spiritual at this period of time, and they often had church services within their own communities that were probably not supervised by whites, but at least under the slave codes, there was supposed to be a white person supervising any mass meeting. This was to put down any rebellion type situation. They were subject to all the criminal codes. Whites were required to treat slaves humanely. Now, what did that mean? Well, obviously, it supposedly would mean that they weren't supposed to beat them unmercifully, and they weren't supposed to kill them, and they weren't supposed to do all these things. Again, everything is subjective, and obviously some of those inhumane situations did take place. Slaves had a right to a trial by jury of whites. So slaves only could be tried by white people in a court of law. Now, if you were a slave in Missouri, you could sue for your freedom. Now, again, that sounds probably better than what it was. Number one, most slaves would not have understood the situation, how they could even sue, nor could they afford a lawyer. It was probably one of those situations that wasn't nearly as good as it sounded. And the last one is actually, I mistyped it. It says whites who were not owners could mistreat slaves. That should read could not mistreat slaves. Slaves were valuable property to the white people. And as a result, they did not want someone else coming in and abusing their slaves. They considered a slave, I'm not trying to be, bad here, but they considered a slave nothing more than an animal. And as a result, you would not want somebody coming in and beating your horse or your mule, because that was a valuable piece of property to you. Well, the same way with slaves. Whites would not want somebody else coming in and mistreating their slaves. So, that was one of the things that did kind of help protect them. Now, obviously, not everybody that was slaves, took to this very kindly. Most of them didn't. And there were runaway slaves. And this happens to be, I found this is a copy of a reward poster that was posted in Greene County, Missouri, where I live. It says, ran away from the subscribers living 12 miles west of Springfield, Missouri, Greene County, Missouri, on the night of the 21st. Two Negroes described as follows: Arca, belonging to James L. Alexander, is a mulatto man, some 21 years of age or upwards, some 5'6" high, has gray eyes, plays the fiddle well. And then there was John, belonging to John A. Miller, is rather a dark complected man, some 28 years old, about 6 feet high, heavy built, weighs some 180 pounds, has rather a positive way of affirming or denying, and basically saying what they will give. Now you'll notice up here, the reward, $1,000, and actually I believe that was changed to $1,500 somewhere in this writing. I read it, but they were offering a reward up to $1,000 for the return of these slaves. Folks, these were valuable pieces of property. And so again, they, you treated them as well as you might, treat someone. Okay, the Dred Scott decision. Missouri was home to probably the most important Supreme Court decision prior to the Civil War that had to do with slavery. And that was the Dred Scott decision of 1857. Some people say that this is the Supreme Court decision that made the Civil War inevitable. That once it was issued, Civil War was an inevitability. So, 1857, the Supreme Court issued a decision known as the Dred Scott decision, which had a profound effect on slavery across America. Dred Scott was a slave, and he was owned by an army doctor who lived in Missouri. But in his travels, being an army doctor, he was sent around to different posts. He was transported to several states, primarily Minnesota, in 1834 before returning to Missouri in 1838. And he took Dred with him. Dred was his personal service slave. And so he had been home in free states, principally Minnesota. So once the doctor died, Scott then sued for his freedom, claiming he had been a resident of a free state. Now, I've read quite extensively about the Dred Scott decision. There's a lot of people that feel that this was a cause taken up by the abolitionists at the time, and that the doctor's widow was actually complicit in this, in hopes that Dred Scott would win his freedom and thus championing the abolitionist cause. Nobody knows that for sure because she never said that. But there's a great deal of intuition that she was complicit in this and that she intended for Scott to be free. Unfortunately for Scott, the Missouri State Supreme Court ruled against him. Originally, he won his first case, and they said that he could gain his freedom, but then they ruled against him in the Supreme Court case, in the Missouri Supreme Court. His case was appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and in 1857, they upheld the state's court decision against Scott. So, in 1857, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled against Dred Scott, saying that he could not be freed just because he had gone to a free state. And then they went further. And this is where the Dred Scott decision really has implications for the Civil War. They ruled five different things occurred as a result of the Dred Scott decision. Number one, they said Dred Scott could not be free because he was not a citizen. And he said slaves were property. So, this was settled, in their mind, at least on the Supreme Court. They said slaves are property. He could not be free because he wasn't a citizen. He said that slavery was constitutionally protected in the United States. And indeed, if you look at the Constitution as it was written at that time, then indeed it did say that slavery was a constitutionally protected situation. On top of that, they said the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which had outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territories as well as any future territories north of the 36-30-degree parallel line. We talked about that when we talked about Missouri coming into the Union. They said that was unconstitutional. They said, you can't do that. And then the Supreme Court said, oh, by the way, the whole Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. In other words, they basically said slavery was constitutional everywhere in the United States. Now, if there was any doubt that we were going to have a civil war after this decision, it was pretty well over. I think everybody in America figured out that sooner or later, the two sides, the abolitionist side and the slave side, was going to have a civil war. And indeed, it was only a couple of years later that civil war broke out, which, by the way, is what we're going to start talking about here in a couple of weeks. So this is Dred Scott, hugely important Supreme Court case coming out of Missouri. Now, as we all know, the Civil War was fought. And again, we're going to talk about that in quite at length for several weeks. We're going to talk about the course of the Civil War in the Ozarks and in Missouri. After the Civil War, several things took place really rapidly. Number one, the Constitution was amended 3 different times in a matter of a couple of years. The 13th Amendment was passed to free the slaves because the Constitution had to be amended. The 14th Amendment gave them the citizenship rights, said, since the court had ruled they were not citizens, they passed an amendment saying they were citizens. The 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. So these 3 were passed really rapidly after the Civil War. So how did this affect the Ozarks? How did the Civil War and the passage of these 3 amendments affect the population of slaves or former slaves in the Ozarks? Well, first of all, a lot of slaves in Missouri chose to leave because even though they had, been given these freedoms now, it still was not a hospitable place. They owned very little, if any, property, and there wasn't much of an opportunity for them to gain property. Employment was practically non-existent. After all, Missouri had been really devastated by the Civil War. And as a result, there was not a lot of employment, period, let alone for former slaves. Most whites in Missouri, even though most whites were not slave owners, they were hostile to slaves or former slaves. And this is what happened. Most of them left Missouri, except in the interior of the Ozarks. Surprisingly, if you look at the statistics, the number of blacks in the Ozarks, both before and then after the Civil War, did not change radically. Most of the slaves, once they became free in the Ozarks, chose to stay with their former owners. Why? Well, number one, what else were they going to do? They basically had no choice in their mind but to stay around. And in all honesty, it wasn't that bad comparatively to other parts of Missouri, like the Little Dixie area of the Missouri River Valley area. So, what former slaves stayed in the Ozarks, they remained with their former masters, doing work for maybe for nothing, just living there. Remember, most people in the Ozarks didn't own slaves, and the ones that did only had just one or two or three. So they stayed there, maybe as cooks, maybe as farmhands or whatever, in return for, enjoying the fruits of safety. Now, only Greene County really had a large population of ex-slaves after the Civil War. So let's look at Springfield's African-American Black population after the Civil War. Surprisingly, from about 1865 to about 1900, in that 35-year period, the slave population, the former slave population in Springfield, I'm not going to say they flourished, but they most certainly enjoyed an increase in their abilities to have employment, to get an education, etc. They were still discriminated against. I'm not trying to paint a good picture here at all. I'm just trying to tell you that in terms of what you might have seen in other parts of Missouri, the Springfield area seemed to be a little bit easier to get along in at that point in time. For instance, there were African Americans that were on the city council in Springfield before 1900. The coroner was an African American, folks. That is no small thing. The coroner, next to the sheriff, was considered the chief local public office holder at that period of time. He was very important because he oftentimes determined the estates and things like this. So the coroner was a very big deal. The fact that the coroner in Greene County at one point in time was a black is really, to me, amazing. That shows you that there must have been some kind of affinity going on there. 3 African Americans were actually on the school board. That doesn't mean the blacks and whites went to school together, but there was a school board that determined, the school policy. And there was a black school in Springfield. It's called the Lincoln School. And the Lincoln School, by the way, still exists. It's part of the OTC campus today. The building is. African Americans were officers with both the sheriff's department and the police department. There were blacks on both the sheriff's and the police department at one time before 1900. The largest grocery store in Springfield, if you would have gone to Tyndall's or Harvard's grocery store in Springfield at that time, which were 2 of the largest grocery stores in the city, they were both owned by blacks. So again, there was something going on here, positive, as it might be. In fact, the case, there's a real famous guy by the name of Dux Major. Dux Major actually built the first automobile in Springfield. He built it by hand. He was a mechanic, and he built this car And I've got a photograph of it. It's not a very good photograph, but it shows you Dux Major tooling around in his first car. This is the Tyndall Market. This is one of the largest grocery stores in the city of Springfield. It was black owned. This was a photograph of African American high school graduates prior to 1900. And again, they were at least getting an education. This is old Dux Major. He was tooling around in his automobile. He built that by hand. He built this car by hand before Henry Ford started building cars in his assembly line. That's a pretty big deal, folks, that he was able to do this. So I don't want to make it sound like everything was rosy in Springfield, because it wasn't, because there was an undercurrent of obviously prejudice and bigotry that still existed. And unfortunately, that rose to the top around 1906. So an incident occurred in 1906 that forever changed the whole presence of Blacks in the Springfield and the Ozarks area. So again, most Blacks, most African Americans in the Ozarks still suffered from discrimination and prejudice. They held menial jobs. For the most part, they lived in segregated areas, mostly north of Commercial Street at that time. Lynchings were not uncommon. Springfield had 3 illegal lynchings during this period of time: 1859, 1871, and then the infamous one of 1906, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Pierce City had a really bad incident in 1901. It was bad enough that not only did they lynch a Black person, they actually burned the Black residents out, and they left. Most of them came to Springfield. Some went to Joplin, but Joplin had its own incident in 1903, where they illegally lynched a Black person. But by far and away, the biggest incident that occurred in Springfield in 1906. There were outlying communities that actually passed laws against African Americans. And again, that's not surprising. If you've lived in the Ozarks, you've probably heard these stories, as I have heard, that communities often had these signs posted that there were no Blacks allowed in the city, at least after sundown, that they had to be just passing through. 1906, there's a very infamous incident that occurred on the public square in Springfield, Missouri. It's the lynching of 3 young Black men. This is a monument to them that's placed downtown, and you can see that it says on Good Friday, April 13th, 1906, Springfield and Greene County had a thriving population of African American professionals, business owners, community leaders. By the early hours of Easter Sunday, the city had been overwhelmed by hate and violence because of false allegations that 2 Black men, Morris B. Duncan and Fred Coker, had assaulted a white woman. A lynch mob was formed, and the 2 were taken to the city jail for their protection. A 3rd young Black man, William Allen, was already in the jail. The mob broke into the jail and took Mr. Duncan and Mr. Coker to the city square, where they were hanged from the Godfrey Tower, an iron structure topped with a replica of the Statue of Liberty. Not satisfied with lynching the 2 men, the mob returned to the jail and brought Mr. Allen to be lynched. By Easter Sunday morning, all that remained was a pile of ashes and the men's burned bodies, A crowd of thousands watched both public spectacle lynchings. Fearing further violence, many African Americans left the city, some never to return. After the lynching, a grand jury met, indicted 18 men who were involved in the incident. 1 man was brought to trial. No one was ever convicted of the murders. So that's it in a nutshell. So let's look at what happened here. By 1906, there had begun to be some incidents that had risen concern amongst the white population of Springfield. Several incidents of what they considered violence by the African American population against white people. And so it was kind of like a powder keg waiting for a match to be lit. And that happened on Friday, Good Friday, April 13th, 1906. What happened was this: Mina Edwards who had left her husband in Fair Play sometime earlier, had traveled to Springfield and had taken up with a man by the name of Cooper. And she had become his mistress for all practical purposes, working at a brothel on Commercial Street. On that night, Good Friday, she at least claimed that she was raped. The next morning, her and her male companion, Mr. Cooper, told the police that she'd been raped by 2 African Americans, and the police arrested 2 youths she identified as her assailants. Here's what happened on that. They got Cooper and the woman, put them in a car, drove them around the black areas of Springfield until Mr. Cooper said, "There's one of them. I know him." Now, that was despite the fact that he had already told the police officers that the 2 youths had masks on. So, even the police were a little bit reluctant, like, how can you really identify this man when he had a mask on? But they nevertheless arrested him. And since that man by the name of Forrest Dunkard, and since Duncan's best friend lived right near him, Ned Coker, they arrested him also. And so they took him into jail, the Springfield Police Department. Now, here's where it gets really bad. Their employer, who was a white man, heard about the arrest. He went to the police station. He said, "Guys, when did this thing take place?" And they said around midnight to 1 o'clock in the morning. He said, "That didn't happen. These 2 men were working for me overnight. I can testify to that." This was a very well-known, prominent man, a white man in the city of Springfield. And he said, "This absolutely did not happen because these guys were there. I was there. I know they were working, and they are not who you're looking for." So the Springfield police released them. Unfortunately, by that time, the rumor mill had started. And Saturday night, people started milling around, or pardon me, Saturday day started milling around the square in Springfield. And it became very concerning to the Greene County Sheriff and to the police department. The Greene County Sheriff, in spite of the fact that they had been released and their white owner had given them a clean bill of health, so to say, he went back and arrested them again and put them in the Greene County Jail. And that night, Saturday night, a riot broke out, a mob broke out of several thousand people. Nobody knows for sure. I've read figures that said it was anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 people. Roamed around the square in Springfield, finally went to the jail north of the square, broke the 2 men out, took them back to the square. And by that time, the reports is that they were probably already dead because they'd been beaten unmercifully with sledgehammers. And by that time, they took them and hung them from the Godfrey Tower and started a bonfire below them until the ropes burned through and their bodies dropped into the ashes and burned up. The bloodlust was still there. They went back to the jail, broke another man out who had absolutely nothing to do with that incident, although he was in jail for another incident. They took him to the square and they hung him also. So it was just a horrible situation. The next morning, as I said, I've kind of just told you what happened here. The next morning, Easter Sunday morning, most of these people that were involved in the lynching went off to church. By the way, folks, there's unfortunately, and this shows you how bad this situation was, there was mementos that were printed up, postcards that were printed up celebrating the lynching. There were actually medallions made up, metal medallions. And on one side of it said Easter offering. And it was in memory of the lynching that took place on Good Friday. It was Good Friday weekend, Easter weekend. It was just an absolutely horrible situation. What happened as a result of it? Well, there was such concern that there was going to be further violence that the governor, the next day on Monday, sent in 100 state militia and basically patrolled the city because they were so concerned there was going to be more violence. Many of the Black people in Springfield, remember, Springfield had this large professional group of Blacks that they were actually thriving in that sense, left the city, never to return permanently. As a result, Springfield basically developed into a fairly white city. This is another picture of the public square. That's the Godfrey Tower with the replica of the Statue of Liberty attached to it. It was from this platform that they hung the 3 Black men. Now, though that's a picture of the troops that were bivouacked at the courthouse. Now, what's the situation today in the Ozarks? Well, if you live in the Ozarks, you know that the Black population in the Ozarks is really small. Just to give you an idea, look at this. This is from the last census, 2020 census. Springfield has a population of Blacks upwards of about 4.4%. And folks, that's probably an inflated number because I'm sure that includes a lot of college students who are not here permanent residents because Springfield has a lot of college students. Republic, 1%. Nixa, 0.06%. Ozark, 0.02%. Willard actually has 1.4%. Joplin has 3.2%. Branson has a larger population percentage-wise than Springfield does because of the entertainment situation. Monette, at 2020 census, there was not one Black person living in Monette. West Plains, 0.02%. And these are some of the major towns and cities in the Ozarks. If you think about some of the outlying areas, I'm sure that there are many, many, many areas of the Ozarks that has absolutely no Black population in them. In fact, Springfield, in one research census, was showed to be the 6th whitest major city in the United States. Now, does that make it a bad city? No, it does not. It just means that there was a horrible situation that occurred in the Ozarks 100 years plus ago, and that I would like to think that we've all learned better. I would like to think that we all know better by now, and that I would like to think that a situation like this could never, ever again occur, not just in the Ozarks, but anywhere in the United States. Now, next week, we're going to look at a different population. We are going to look at the population of there's some other foreign-born immigrants, because there were other people besides the Scotch-Irish and the Blacks in the Ozarks. Germans primarily. So we're going to look at the German population primarily in the Ozarks next week, because there was a huge German population came into the Ozarks. They were different from the Scotch-Irish. They tended to stick together. And so we're going to talk about that next week. And then we're going to jump into the Civil War for about 5 weeks. We're going to talk about the Civil War in depth, which is an extremely interesting topic. And I hope you'll stay with me when we talk about it. So that's what we're going to do next week. I appreciate you being with me. I know this was kind of a depressing topic and a depressing story, but it's a story that needs to be told because it's a part of history. And I'm not one of these that thinks that we ought to just forget about the ugly parts of history. History has warts and blemishes, and we definitely have our warts and blemishes in this country. So thank you for being with me, and I will see you next week, I hope.
You will. Bye-bye.